Today I want to begin discussing another biological idea or concept that helps explain how the Yellowstone ecosystem came to be and how the organisms within it came to be, and that is evolutionary theory. And so I just want to say up front that as we look at evolutionary theory, this is verified theory. This is not just the theory in the concept of the general public, I think. Biologists look at evolutionary theory as being factual, much as physicists look at gravitational theory as being factual. They may argue about some of the nuances, and we do the same thing in biology in regards to evolution. But again, this is verified theory. So it's at once kind of a simple idea, but also a complex idea, as we'll discuss over the next couple of modules. So beginning with evolution, just kind of defining what it is, evolution is genetic change in populations over time. And another way of describing this is that it would be a change in allelic frequencies in a population over time. So again, that's kind of a simple idea, but to kind of further explain this, let's say we have a population that is a mixture of, if we're looking at a particular locus on a particular gene, let's say we have a mixture of genotypes. So we have heterozygotes and homozygous recessives. And so if we were looking at the alleles here, about 20% of the alleles here would be dominant alleles in this population, small population. 80% of the alleles would be recessive alleles. So if something were to cause mortality here, so for example, let's say that the heterozygotes were at some disadvantage in this ecosystem and they died out, that would leave the homozygous recessives then to reproduce with one another. There would only be recessive alleles in the population. So in a pretty short period of time, the population could transition from 80%, 20% to 100% recessive alleles. So again, this is kind of a simple change, but just this change in the allelic frequency of the population then really is what evolution is all about. And as we'll talk about later, if enough of these kind of changes accumulate in a population, then we can get speciation events, new species evolving. So again, I also want to define what we're talking about in this class when we talk about evolution. In the public's mind, there are some different ideas that get kind of mixed up. The origin of the universe is one idea that can be explored. How life originated would be another. But in this class, when we're talking about evolution, we'll be talking about origin of species. So we're interested about how species originate. And so this is really what we call biological evolution. So origin of species would be biological evolution, and that's how we're defining evolution in this class. As everyone knows, I think, Charles Darwin is considered the father of evolutionary theory. He came up with his ideas as he traveled around the world on a cartography, a map-making journey aboard the HMS Beagle. And by the early 1840s, he had developed manuscripts about evolution. He eventually published in 1859 when another Englishman had come up with some of the same basic ideas. Again, I'd like to talk about it in a little more detail, but for this class, we're just going to kind of stick to the basics. So again, kind of early in the 1840s, he already had this idea of a tree of life, a common ancestry of organisms, and trying to explain that common ancestry. And eventually published his work, we refer to as Origin of Species. You can see the title there is a little bit longer, but anyway, that's kind of his signature work published in, as I mentioned, in 1859. So some of the conclusions that Darwin came to during his voyage and afterwards, certainly one was that the observations that he made was that a variation occur within species. And again, no real argument there. We may look at bison or other organisms in the Yellowstone ecosystem and think they all look alike, but if you look closely, you'll find individual nuances for individuals. And again, this is something that Darwin meticulously documents in Origin of Species. So Origin of Species is kind of interesting because he's very meticulous about documenting all of these ideas. Secondly, that more young are produced than will ever survive. And so again, he observed this all over the world in different species. And he realized that this also then created a struggle for existence, a competition for existence. Thirdly, he felt that traits are inherited from parents. And so this is one of the weaknesses of Origin of Species in that he didn't really know Mendel's work, although Mendel was doing his genetic work about the same time. He didn't really understand what DNA was. He didn't really understand inheritance, but he did think that there was some physical material that went from generation to generation, that could be modified, and that was responsible for the traits that we see. And he documents basically, looks at breeding, that you breed organisms and can see the traits in their offspring. And so he felt that there was some physical material responsible for that. And then last but not least, and again, so the traits go from parents to offspring. So he was confident of that and documented that. He just didn't know what the stuff was and how to predict it. And then lastly, he felt that selection for traits was possible. And he mainly looked at breeding here as well, because all of the domesticated plants and animals had been developed through selective breeding. But he also then meticulously documents how nature also selects for traits, how you find specific organisms tailored to specific environments. And so he documents how nature actually selects for traits, just as we do in our own breeding. So again, this can lead to massive antlers that we have in moose. It can lead to a different kind of massive antler that we have in elk. It can lead to horns in different types of species. So again, nature selecting for specific kinds of traits and modifications of these horns. So Darwin looked at his concept of evolution as descent with modification. So he felt that this physical material was being passed from generation to generation, as we know it does today, and that it could be modified by various forces. Primarily, he thought natural selection, but we know that there are other forces that drive this as well today, and we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. So one thing I also want to clearly state up front is that when we talk about Darwinism, it in no way equates modern evolutionary theory. And people who do equate Darwinism with modern evolutionary theory, quite frankly, either do not understand evolution or are coming from a perspective and are trying to manipulate people. Quite honestly, that's just it. So comparing Darwinism to modern evolutionary theory is like comparing smoke signals to modern communications. They're just not the same thing. So, Darwinism is an idea that's 150 years old. We've learned an awful lot since then. But we still respect Darwin because in many respects, most respects, he was right on. It's just that we know a lot more detail than he did. Okay, so as we look at forces that drive evolution then, and evidence for those, I'm just going to go through an overview first, and then we'll look at these specifics. But one is inheritance. Also, random genetic change drives evolution, natural selection, something called genetic drift, and also migration. So these are some of the concepts we're going to explore. So first, looking at inheritance. So again, if we go back into the 1800s, 1700s, people thought that life routinely, spontaneously generated from non-living sources. For example, people thought that maggots arose from decaying meat, for example. So again, today we know that that's not the case. Life begets life. Organisms beget organisms. And also that genetic materials we've talked about, the chromosomes, genes, get passed from generation to generation. So that's an important concept to understand. Now, because genes and chromosomes get passed from generation to generation then, there's a certain biological reality. If organisms share genes, that means a common ancestry. So this is something that you don't really hear a lot of creationist groups talk about because, again, there's no answer for this, no other explanation for this that we know of. So the biological explanation for shared genes is a common ancestry. So when we demonstrate organisms sharing genes, again, it means they have a common ancestor. So again, some of this we've talked a lot about. So evidence for this, and again, abundant evidence for this. This is not really something that is questioned. We know that organisms share genes. And so one of the evidence for this is that there is universal genetic material. All organisms are going to be using DNA and RNA as their genetic material. Also, there's a universal genetic code. So all of the organisms in the Yellowstone ecosystem are going to be using exactly the same code to build their proteins. And so, again, we've talked about this in previous modules, and there's really no question about this. Also, we've talked about Mendelian inheritance. We know and can predict how genes and chromosomes go from generation to generation. So again, if we have organisms that share genes, it trace back to a common ancestry. And one of the really interesting examples of this, I think, is recently the chimpanzee genome has been sequenced, and the human genome has been sequenced for a while. And there were some really interesting realizations here. Certainly, we knew that humans and chimpanzees were close relatives. They're are each other's closest relative, have the most recent common ancestor to one another than either does to any other organism that lives today. And so when you look at the similarity here, it's just unbelievable. If you look at the overall similarity, the difference is only about 4% in the overall genome. This is due to areas where you have insertions of different types of chromosomes, you have some deletions, you have some base substitutions, but again, 96% the same, only about 4% different. And when you look at the area that's about 96% similar, there the difference is only about 1.2%. When you look at our proteins, almost a third of our proteins are absolutely identical. About 70% of the proteins differ by fewer than 2 amino acids per 100 amino acids in a protein. And so again, this is remarkable similarity because when you actually look within our own species, there's a 1% variation within our own species. So the difference between being a human and being a chimpanzee is remarkably small. And again, the fact that we share so much of our genome, the only biological explanation that we know that can explain this is a common ancestry. Another little addition to this is one of the things that's kind of interesting is that chimpanzees actually have a different number of chromosomes. They have 24 chromosomes, we have pairs of chromosomes, we have 23. And so one of the questions has been, somewhere in our ancestry, did a chromosome split or was there a fusion of chromosomes? And so when you look at the chromosomes of chimpanzees, they have 2 chromosomes that we consider chromosome number 2s. And if it was a fusion of chromosomes, in other words, if one of the things that distinguishes us from chimpanzees is that chimpanzee chromosomes fuse together, what we would expect to find is evidence of 2 areas where centromeres could attach. And then also in the center of the chromosome, we'd expect to find regions that we call telomeres. Telomeres are the ends of chromosomes. There are certain sequences that we associate with the ends of chromosomes. So we would expect to find evidence of telomeres in the center of our chromosome number 2 if it was a fusion of these 2 types of chromosomes from a chimpanzee. And so when you look at our chromosome number 2, again, we do see evidence of telomeric sequences in the center. And we do see, we do have one functional centromere, and we have another region that is really non-functional but has sequences associated with centromeres. And also we find the genes, the same genes that we find in the chimpanzee chromosomes aligned in the appropriate locations. So again, this is absolute evidence that humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestry because we share the same chromosomes, although they're arranged a little bit differently. Okay, another driving force of evolution is random genetic change. And another thing I want to also emphasize here is that when we look at evolution, a lot of times people will say, well, don't tell me that I'm some accident of nature. Well, there are some aspects of evolution which truly are, I wouldn't say accidental necessarily, but are random. Inheritance is random. You can't determine which genes go to the next generation. And the same is true of random genetic change, mutation. So these are both random processes, but not all of the processes are completely random, and I'll get to that in a second. So random genetic change is what accounts for new traits. This is where new characteristics come from, new proteins come from. So as we look at this concept, which we talked about before, so changes in the nucleotide sequence lead to changes potentially in the amino acid sequence, which can lead to changes in protein shape, which can lead to changes in protein function. So again, once you start changing the nucleotide sequence, this has downstream effects. And ultimately, nature decides the value of these changes. So this is the role of natural selection, which we'll get to later. Natural selection. Nature decides if this new trait has value. If it does, it will accumulate in the population over time, changing the genetic makeup of the population. If nature doesn't think of its value, it may take it out. You may die. It may hurt your survivability. So if these changes increase your ability to survive and increase your reproductive ability, genes accumulate in the population. If they hurt you, you die and you don't reproduce, and those genes are eliminated from the population. So again, random genetic change then leads to new characteristics. Nature decides the value of those characteristics. So we've talked about mutation already. We've talked about random genetic change, which is mutation, and we've talked about point mutations and the different types of point mutations. Transpositions would be another force here. Polymerase misreads, chromosomal abnormalities, all of these kinds of things that we've talked about in previous modules. But all of these then scramble at the genome, produce new traits. Nature decides the value of those traits. And among those chromosomal abnormalities, translocations, inversions, non-disjunction events. So again, there are many ways in which nature scrambles up the genome, kind of experimenting. Sometimes it works, sometimes it produces an advantage, sometimes it doesn't. But nature makes that decision. So again, as we look at this also from the perspective of being verified theory, again, are traits inherited from parents? No question about it. Do common genes, is that evidence of common ancestry? No question about it. I mean, that's real. Random genetic change, does mutation occur all the time? Can we document where mutations occur? Absolutely. Can we look at different species and see areas where genes have been mutated? Absolutely. So again, these are not theories in the sense that the general public looks at them. These are verified theories. These are facts. So these are true forces that change populations over time. Now the third one then would be natural selection. And again, this is what Darwin spent a lot of time talking about. So as I just mentioned, natural selection is something that Darwin considered. But one thing that you should know about natural selection is that it's not completely random. So there's a directionality, if you will, to natural selection. So natural selection is not completely a random process. So by that I mean there may be advantages or disadvantages based on the environment an organism is living in. So everybody does not survive equally. If everything was random, everyone would have the same chance of surviving and the same chance of reproducing. But the reality is that that's not the case, that nature favors some individuals and does not favor other individuals. So as we look again at how natural selection works, we've talked about how changes in nucleotide sequence can potentially change amino acid sequence, protein shape, protein function. Those new traits then can be acted on by natural selection. Nature decides their value. So at the root of natural selection, what it's all about is differential reproductive success. Not everybody survives, and not everybody survives equally. And not everybody reproduces equally. Some have advantages, some don't. So this differential reproductive success then over time generates genetic change in a population. So differential reproductive success alters a population over time. So if we look at a population, let's say that there are two variants in this population, type A and type B. And so type A or variant A, let's say that on average they produce 3 offspring per generation. So an individual produces 3 offspring, their 3 offspring will produce 3 offspring, and so on through the next several generations. And let's say there's another version or variant in the population within the species that only produces 2 offspring per generation. So they're at some selective disadvantage. And so variant B would produce 2 offspring, their 2 offspring would produce 2 offspring, and so on. I think you can see that, if we had a population starting with equal numbers of variant A and B, that if you looked at that over generations, initially, type A and B would be about 50-50, but because of the selective advantage that type A has, they're more likely to survive, they're more likely to produce more offspring, that over time, their genes accumulate in the population and they basically take over the population over time. So again, natural selection is not completely random. Some individuals favored, some individuals are not favored. And again, same idea that we talked about previously. Again, if heterozygotes are at some selective disadvantage, they die, that can lead to a fairly rapid change in the allelic frequencies of a population. So again, just a change in allelic frequencies, that's all evolution is. And potentially if enough of these accumulate in a population, we get new species. So again, this produces variation within species and also potentially can create new species if enough time and enough change occurs. So let's look at some specific examples. Again, how do we know that traits can be selected for? Well, we have all of the domesticated plants and animals. That's some evidence for that. But again, we can kind of look at this from a scientific perspective. Scientists will look at some things to see if they might be able to manipulate them. And so one example of this is some researchers were looking at fruit fly lifespan. They were interested in lifespan. They wondered if lifespan can be manipulated or selected for. And so what they did with the fly population was that they took a fly population. They basically would deny them food or let them starve until 80% of the flies had died. Then they would return food to those that had these longer lifespans. And then they would let them reproduce, collect the eggs, and then repeat with the next generation. So in the first generation, the average lifespan was about 20 hours. In the second lifespan, they had already increased lifespan to about 23 hours. And at the end of 60 generations, they had increased lifespan of the fruit fly to 160 hours. So again, by selectively breeding, you can manipulate the genetic makeup of a population and change traits in that population. So now the question is, can nature do the same thing? And again, I think Darwin did a pretty good example of this in documenting changes. But let's go ahead and look at an example that some researchers did. So they basically were looking at three different pools. One pool in which a fish called a killifish lived, another in which a similar fish, a related fish called a pike cichlid lived, and then there's a second pool with killifish in it. Now also in some of these pools, guppies lived, and so guppies have a juvenile phase, which is kind of drab, and then the adult phase is more colorful because color attracts mates. So the more colorful the guppies are, the more likely they are to attract a mate and be successfully breed. So with the killifish, here the killifish feed on juvenile guppies. And so there's no pressure on the adults. And so the adults in these ponds with the killifish tend to be very colorful. And again, that's important because the more colorful you are, the better you are at reproducing. Now, in this pike cichlid pond, there are also guppies here, but the pike cichlids feed on adult guppies. So there's kind of a problem here. The guppy wants to be colorful to attract a mate, but if it's too colorful, it's easy to see, and the pike cichlids will feed on you and eat you. So here it would be a selective disadvantage to be overly colorful, yet you have to be colorful enough to attract mates. So in this pond here then, with the pike cichlid, the adult guppies were more or less drab. So anyway, in the third pond there were killifish but no guppies. And so what some researchers decided to do then was to take these drab adult guppies and transferred some of them to the pond that had killifish in it. And recall that killifish feed on juvenile guppies, so there's no selective pressure against coloration in the adults. And so what was predicted was that over time, since there was no longer a selective pressure against being colorful, and there was pressure to be colorful because it would make you more successful in mating, it was predicted that over time guppies would become more colorful in this particular pond. And sure enough, if you look at what happened, if you look at the size of the spots, they increased in the population after transplantation, and also the number of spots increased in the transplanted population. So again, here's a very specific example of how nature was selecting for a trait, and again, not everybody survived equally. And again, there have just been hundreds of these kinds of experiments done. So again, can traits be selected for? Absolutely. Can nature select for traits? Absolutely, no question about it. Now, as we look at natural selection, then there are kind of three types of selection that we see occurring. One is what's known as stabilizing selection. And so if we consider a range of phenotypes, here we're looking at some type of a rodent. So if we look at a range of phenotypes, and let's say that there's a certain distribution of these animals in the ecosystem, and let's say here that the intermediate colors are the most numerous in this ecosystem. If the heterozygote, and we'll basically consider those heterozygotes, but if the intermediate form, the intermediate phenotype has a selective advantage, so in other words, if they have some type of an advantage, and that is selected for over time in that population, we refer to that as stabilizing selection. So when the intermediate phenotype is selected for, we refer to that as a stabilizing selection. Now, there can also be what we call a directional selection. And in a directional selection, either one extreme phenotype or the other extreme phenotype will be selected for. So in other words, in this case, maybe the dark individuals have an advantage, or if the other extreme has an advantage and the population shifts in that direction over time, we consider that directional selection. So when one extreme or the other extreme has an advantage, we call that directional selection. And then another example here would be if both extremes have some advantage. So again, there might be areas of an ecosystem that are very light and very dark, and so that allows the dark individuals to blend in, and it allows the light individuals to blend in. So if both of those two have an advantage, we refer to that as disruptive selection. So over time, what would happen is that we get kind of a camelback shape to our population distribution. So again, stabilizing selection would be where the intermediate types have an advantage, they accumulate over time, Directional selection would be where one extreme phenotype or the other extreme phenotype has some type of an advantage. They accumulate in the population over time. And then disruptive selection would be where both extremes simultaneously have an advantage, and so the intermediate types tend to disappear and the two extremes build up in the population. Now, also as we look at natural selection, again, we have this direct evidence. We literally can do these in the field. We can see whether nature selects for traits, and again, there's no question that nature does select for traits. But we also look for other verifications of this, and so there are also a lot of statistical models that also predict that natural selection exists. One of the more famous examples is something called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. We're not going to get into a lot of detail on this, but basically what the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium states or predicts is that over time, as genes go from generation to generation, that there will be no change in genetic allelic frequencies. So it predicts that there will be no change over time. But the reality is that when you look at populations, you do see genetic change in populations over time. So the explanation for this then is that nature selects for traits. So again, the idea of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and the only way that you will see the Hardy-Weinberg requirements met is if you have a small population, if all individuals in the population mate, and if individuals in the population randomly mate. So in other words, the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium says that there will be no change in populations over time according to random laws of probability. So in other words, if there was no selection in nature, there would be no genetic change in populations over time. But when you look at populations, first of all, do all individuals in a population mate? If we look at the Yellowstone ecosystem, are all of the elk going to grow to adulthood and all of the elk going to mate with one another? Certainly not. Is that true of grizzly bears? Certainly not. Is it true of grasses even? Certainly not. Is it true of aspen even? No. And then secondly, and this is especially true in animals where you would not be able to see this, but mating also must be random. So again, is mating random in the elk population, bison population, grizzly bear population? No. There's always criteria for mating, particularly among animals. Just as you and I don't mate randomly, neither is a bison, neither is an elk, neither is a bald eagle, and so on. So the bottom line then is that natural selection is not a random process. And we'll talk more about evolution next time.